Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I have my March wrap-up. Once again, I apologise for Sally's pause on the laminate flooring, and this video might end somewhat quickly and you'll see me in a few days depending on when people arrive home. But I thought it's a good place to start as we do have quite a few books to get through in this wrap-up. Ones I won't be talking about are All This Could Be Different by Sarah Thankum Matthews, Bliss Montage by Ling, Now Is Not the Time to Panic by Kevin Wilson, and Carrie Soto Is Back by Taylor Jenkins Reid, as these are all books that I read for the Booktube prize, and as such I will probably talk about them in a separate video once the results have been announced. The first book that I finished in March, although I read a lot of it in February, is Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. Now, if you followed my channel throughout January and February, you will have seen that I did struggle somewhat in the beginning of the reading of this book. And that was basically, sometimes I was seeing a lot of parallels with Charles Dickens' David Copperfield, and I was thinking, well, this is going to happen and then this will happen, and I was seeing all these things that could possibly occur, thinking a lot about what happened in the original text. And also with it discussing the opioid crisis and it being a bit darker, I found myself somewhat reticent to pick this book up. And then I decided, you know what, there's no rush to read this book. I apologised to Charlie because we were buddy reading this book originally and just said I was going to take it at my own pace, which is what I did. And in taking it at my own pace, I ended up enjoying the book a lot more. Enjoying is perhaps the wrong word, but maybe appreciating it. I thought that it was a really fantastic piece of fiction and was glad that it appeared on the Women's Prize longlist, because I think that what Barbara Kingsolver has really done is used David Copperfield as a basis to riff off of and to emphasise that whilst this was the tale of David Copperfield, while a lot of it could be synonymous with Victorian England, a lot of what goes on in that book is somewhat still going on in different parts of society. Now, I know that this was set in the 1990s at the height of the opioid crisis, and it was almost surreal to have read this book at the same time, well, not the same time, but just after I'd read Prozac Nation by Elizabeth Wurzel. And it might have been the fact that I was reading these books so close together that I steered clear of this a bit more. But once again, in terms of Barbara Kingsolver and Demon Copperhead, I had this happen before with her book, The Lacuna. I read The Lacuna and I forgot that I was reading from a fictional character's perspective. And I've had that happen a few times with books where I've become so engrossed in the world and in the way that the narrator speaks that I forget that they aren't real. And with Demon Copperhead, I forgot that this character was fictional, and it was one of those things similar to when I was talking about Lucy Barton a few months ago. I ended up stopping and being like, oh, this didn't happen, but at the same time knowing that what goes on with the characters within that book definitely did happen to people in some way. And it's a tough one. I think that what Kingsolver did was shine a light on people that we often forget about and gave us something to think about when we think about the term redneck and the way that denigrates a certain part of society. And I think that if you were looking at people in the UK, it would probably be the way that we look at people who live on council estates and the drug problems that can be seen as being rife there. And I think that there was just so much within the writing and so much, not to just to learn, but I found it engaging and dramatic, and I felt that the characters were drawn exceptionally well, and I just wholeheartedly ended up adoring the book in the end, which wasn't something that I expected when I went into it. I did expect the tragedies because there are tragedies within the original text, and I was messaging Charlie for spoilers because I was thinking this is going to happen, and in the end what I thought was going to happen didn't happen in the way that I thought it would. It is a tragedy, but there are glimmers of hope in there. And something that Kingsolver has done well is the way that she's managed to balance light and shade within this novel. And yeah, I will just say it is superb. So the next book I'm going to talk about I don't recommend, but a lot of people do like it. And that is I'm a Fan by Sheena Patel. I think that's right. I'm not a fan. Don't like it. It's written in a vignette style. At one point in the novel, well, it's not a novel, is it? It's basically a novella in flash fiction. At one point, something happens between two characters. But then by 3 pages down the line, I think the writer has forgotten that she said that had happened. And so something else happens without it being a flashback or anything. And then the next scene, it's almost as though that never happened and we're back to what happened 3 pages before that. And I just didn't like it. I didn't think that there was anything climactic. I felt like it was just a series of this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and oh, I'm fed up with writing now. This is the end of the book. Bye. I hate this book. I think that it does not use the vignette style very well. I don't think that there is anything very strong in terms of characterization. We just have the one narratorial voice. It really just felt like a load of disparate notes that an author would make when they're trying to put a novel together, but it wasn't a fully fledged novel. It wasn't fleshed out. It was just a complete mess of notes thrust together in some sort of manuscript form and expected me to call it a book. And I was completely disappointed and think that it is a terrible waste of everybody's time. Then I read Trespasses by Louise Kennedy and thoroughly adored this book as well. And so in this book, it is set during the Troubles in Ireland, and we have the character of Cushla. And Cushla begins an affair with a married man. There is tension on every single page because the reader goes in, and if you have any knowledge of the Troubles, you end up worrying for the characters. One thing I really liked was the research that the author had done in terms, well, maybe it wasn't research, maybe the author had lived through this period of time as well. And so the bits that I was finding particularly nostalgic, the references that she was making, I just thought that they were so well chosen. And it's one of those things where we always say when it comes to writing, you don't want to overload the reader with all of this research you've done and all of these different aspects of the day-to-day life. And she didn't do that. She cherry-picked them so that it added something to the narrative. Something that I also liked was the intertextuality, the references to other media that Kennedy made within the work. So I talked about the play translations by Brian Friel that she references, and she, again, to use my previous phrase about Demon Copperhead, riffs on that and talks about Cushla teaching Irish to Irish people, and perhaps the way in which the English have almost taken their language and their identity away from them. And then we have this other aspect of it where Cushla goes to a school disco that the police had put on, and there's a reference to the Third Policeman. And if you look into what the book The Third Policeman by Flann O'Brien was about, you can almost see what Kennedy might have been referencing here in that book. The tension is there because Cushla is a teacher, and she could lose her job if she behaves in a certain type of way, because you've got to keep up appearances, because you don't want to be seen to be associating with certain types of people, and she's being told that she shouldn't be associating with these people that she is because it could change people's impression of her. Ultimately, you know that this novel can end in nothing but tragedy. As it says on one page, letter bombs and Molotov cocktails and all these other things have become part of the child's vocabulary. And it's almost tragic to think about this. I thought that characterization was, again, strong characterization, a story that I flew through, characters that I connected with, a tale of family at some points and the turmoil people face in their ordinary lives.
A few moments later.
We've come upstairs because I decided that I don't want to have to wait a long time. Not sat down because, well, the bookcase is now in a different position. So we're stood up. You're balanced on some DVDs, and I've got a lamp that might fall on top of my head before the end of this video. And we'll ignore certain aspects of what's going on in the background. The next book that I read was The Mysterious Case of the Alperton Angels by Janice Hallett. This was an e-arc that I got through NetGalley, and This is from the author of The Appeal. So we've had The Appeal, which is this modern epistolary novel in which the murder mystery that you're being presented with is all through emails and witness statements that happened within this small Amdram production. Then and I really enjoyed that, and I sped through that book. Indeed, I sped through this one as well. And I sped through the author's second book, The Twyford Code, which was supposedly told in these voice notes. And I think that in terms of the voice notes, you did actually... It would have worked better hearing that book. I don't know, I didn't listen to the audiobook, but I did read it, and I didn't much care for that. This one, we are presented with a true crime author who is supposedly researching a cult that was around however many years before, I think it was 20 years before this novel is set. It's all told through WhatsApp messages and messages that the protagonist is sending to her agent and her editor and other writers, and it's all these different messages, and articles come up, and the writer sometimes tries to
A few moments later.
So naturally, my sister turned up, and it's now near 9 o'clock. But we will finish talking about the books I read in March. So we have The Mystery of the Alperton Angels. And this is a cult of people who, many years before the book began, discussed the forthcoming of archangels, and they believed that they were angels themselves and they were going to sacrifice this baby. And throughout the book you get hints as to what was actually going on, and you hear about all these other texts and these TV shows that have all happened related to something going on in the book, and this mystery surrounding who the people actually were because their identities were kept a secret. Unfortunately, I think that Janice Hallett has really shown and emphasised the limitations that come from writing in the epistolary fashion within this book, because there are some really big climactic scenes that unfortunately we don't get the opportunity to see on the page, because everything in there is like reported text, so we don't follow the characters along. We just hear everything that's happened afterwards and all the messages that have been sent. It means that when this really big climax does eventually happen, we don't hear it, and also there's a bit of skipping to another way to tell the end of the story. And unfortunately, at this point, I was recognising the limitations, and there was an aspect of the book that then feels like a gimmick. And in the beginning, when I first read The Appeal, and these books aren't connected, but when I read that book, what I liked about it, we were creating characters based on hearsay and what other people said about them without actually thinking about their general appearance, which is the way that with all these other books you go about thinking about what the character looks like and you formulate the character based on that. And with The Appeal in all these books, because there isn't so much of a heavy emphasis on what characters look like, it is just all about the characters and who they are. Unfortunately, I think that the gimmick has been done to death now, and I really do think that Janice Hallett might have eked out as much as she can eke out of this particular style of writing, and I would really like to see her try and just craft a novel, because similar to when I was talking about I'm a Fan before, it felt like loads of bitty pieces thrust together and called a novel and said have at it, and I'm just not here for it as much as I like experimental fiction. Then I read Cursed Bread by Sophie Mackintosh, which is another book that was longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. And if you go and watch Charlie over at Charlie Brooks Reid talk about this book, she said about how she rechristened this boring bread. And I do agree. The entirety of this book feels like it's building up to the climax, and when I got to the climax, I felt like Sophie Mackintosh might have written that part of the book first, and then was like, oh, now I've got to write 150 pages leading up to this, because it was 150 pages of just boring, and then, oh, here's 30 pages where something interesting is happening. Once again, we have such poor character development in this book, if you can call it any sort of development at all. And I suppose what people get out of this novel is this almost hazy, very thick, claustrophobic sense because of the prose. But I didn't find that. I just found it so dry and dreary and a slog to get through. it really, like, I was reading a lot this month, and this slowed my reading down because I just did not want to read this book. And in the end, I just forced myself to finish it just so that I could be done with it, because I borrowed it from the library. It cost me £1 to reserve it, and I was not wasting my money. But yeah, I don't remember whether the character has a name. I know that it flits back and forth in time, so that you can learn what the tragedy is, and that the character is writing to this character Violet, who we find out what happened to that character in the end. I know that it's based on actual historical events, but it was boring. Unlike Wandering Souls by Cecile Pin. There we go, I remembered it in the end. I'd really been looking forward to this book, and it did not disappoint me. It is about a family of Vietnamese people who, in the beginning of the novel, they are all escaping some sort of tyranny. I don't know enough about history to recall what it was. 3 other children are sent on ahead from one family. Unfortunately, the rest of the family doesn't make it, and because of a lie that the daughter tells, they end up in Thatcher's Britain. And from there, we get to see their lives and the way that intergenerational trauma can affect children. I enjoyed this book. I read this book incredibly quickly. However, that does not mean that I did not find flaws within it. So, firstly, I do like a family saga, and this had aspects of the family saga about it. I like the historical aspects about the novel as well, and I liked having a light shone on a part of the world that I didn't previously know about characters that I didn't previously have knowledge of. Saying that, I do think that the author maybe needed 50 to 100 more pages in order to properly flesh out the story, because this story did something that I absolutely despise, which is getting to about the 200 page mark and skipping forward 30 years into the future to write a very 30 pages of epilogue and round things off. And again, something that I felt with a few of the books that I've talked about here, sometimes felt like disparate pieces that hadn't been fully fleshed out. There were 2 chapters with American soldiers that just didn't go anywhere, so I questioned their inclusion in here. So there was some academic writings in there that the author tried to bring full circle at the end, but I'm not sure they necessarily worked here. And another issue I had was sometimes you've got some American language in there, and these people are supposed to have learnt British English, so that just read weird to me. I enjoyed it, and I appreciated what the author was doing in the book, and I did actually like this one for the most part, but there were a few bits that niggled for me, such as the characters as well. I felt that the characters perhaps weren't as fully developed as they could have been. Whilst I appreciated it, I think that some of the stuff that was going on and some of the more ghostly stuff to do with apparitions and what have you, and the mythology surrounding that and the culture of which the author is talking about, I think it was good to see, but I've also seen it done so many times now in fiction, and in some cases done better, that did really mar my own experiences when reading it. And then I read Human Croquet by Kate Atkinson, which, strangely enough, today I managed to get a copy from the charity shop. This is not the copy of Human Croquet that I read. Indeed, the copy that I borrowed off Joy had a much nicer cover than just a flaming tree. The tree does become important to the narrative. So in the beginning of this novel, we are introduced to Isabel, and she has a mother who disappeared however many years before. Her father disappeared years before reappearing with a new mother for them, for her and her brother Charles. And there's almost a fairy tale-like aspect for it towards this novel. I would say that Kate Atkinson might have been inspired by Roald Dahl with some of the aspects of characters she gave to the family. Now, this is where I realised that Kate Atkinson does like to write about family a lot, and I also perhaps shouldn't have read this so closely after just reading Emotionally Weird and Life After Life and then going into this one. But I did want to read it, and I am still in this mood to consume eight Atkinsons. I'm still in the mood to consume Kate Atkinson's works. So basically, something that's happened in the books I've noticed is there's a lot of young women trying to figure out who they are and figure out their place in the world. And in Human Croquet, Isabel's having to do that without having any knowledge how to behave like a woman because she hasn't had that character there. Her father's been absent for most of her life, and the people that she got left with weren't necessarily being parents to her. There's also this aspect of time warps, and she'll be walking down the road and she'll slip into time and disappear 300 years into the past. There are also bits that interject to tell you the history of the family, which does become important when you're learning what actually happens. And then there is an aspect of the novel that becomes similar to Life After Life and also references A Christmas Carol because of something that happens towards the end of the book. And this is where I have one major drawback with the novel, and it's because of the resolution to all of these time warps and everything going back, because I was here for it just to be a little bit irreverent, and I think that Atkinson might have been told to do this by a publisher, or she was worried what people would think, but she gave it a resolution that just cheapened the entirety of the narrative, in my estimation. But I really did end up liking the book for the most part because of Kate Atkinson's prose, and I really liked the characters she created. They're grotesque and sometimes caricatures of human beings, and I was here for it. Even though the story did seem to be a story that I've seen a lot from Kate Atkinson over the last few months, I didn't mind it until that point. I was finding it humorous. I really like the way that she writes. I like the way she plays with language. This is something that I've talked about a lot recently. The next book I can't get off my shelf, but it is You Will Never Be Forgotten by Mary South, and this is a collection of short stories that a volunteer of mine asked me to read after she read it, and it made her question whether she actually liked short stories anymore. I read the first short story, I really liked it, although a lot of people have told me that it's similar to The Remains of the Day. And indeed, I've actually ended up enjoying the majority of the stories in this collection. I think that Mary South is a really strong short story writer. Some of them, I'll admit, and I agreed with the volunteer when she said this to me, felt a bit gimmicky. But a lot of them did feel strong. And I read an interview with the author where she said a lot of this book and these short stories are dealing with grief, and I can certainly see that in the different facets that come with grief. But there are aspects of the surreal in here. She experiments with form in terms of how to write a short story and convey different characters. Sometimes it did feel very American pretentious short story writer, and I didn't like that, but for the most part I was really impressed with the style and the craft of Mary South's writing. And then you have the last short story in the collection, and that has left a very big impression on me because of certain aspects of that story. I finished it a week ago, I think, and it is haunting me. I had to talk to Charlie about it because it was haunting me so much. It's definitely a strong debut collection, and if this was the book that you wanted to put out to say this is who you are as a writer, then I think that South made a very strong declaration about her writing here. And I would be interested to see what she would create if she were to write a full-length novel, because there are aspects of the surreal and the wry, even though there is something dark within the prose. Yeah, there are some stories that are utterly dehumanising and discuss extremely tough topics, but again, they also ask the question as to what it is to be human, which I think is a big question that a lot of writers will ask in their own work. So a very strong collection all told, and also happens to be the last thing that I read this month, because I'm not really going to talk about the graphic novels that I read this week. I was reading Shrines of Gaiety before tossing that aside to read some graphic novels that I found. So that's me. If you've read any of these books and would like to discuss them, then please feel free to do so in the comments. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all.